On the morning of February 25, 1945, Second Lieutenant Sato Kenji sat in a sulfur-choked bunker 300 feet beneath the northern slopes of Iwo Jima and wrote, by the light of a shielded candle, what he believed would be the last entry in his field journal. He had commanded a machine gun position on the island for 4 months. Since October, watching the invasion he knew was coming take shape in the reconnaissance reports that reached his cave in dwindling numbers as American submarines strangled the supply lines. He was 26 years old, a career soldier who had fought in Manchuria against the Soviets in 1939 and in the jungles of New Guinea in 1943, and he did not consider himself a man given to exaggeration. I have fought the Russians and I have fought in green hell, he wrote, and I tell you now that neither prepared me for what climbs this mountain of ash. We kill them and they do not stop coming. We kill them again and still they come. I begin to wonder if we are fighting men at all or something that has simply decided it cannot be killed. This is not the version of Iwo Jima you have been given in the films. It is not the flag on Suribachi, freeze-framed and triumphant, divorced from the 36 days of grinding, subterranean horror that made that flag possible. It is not John Wayne. It is the version written by the men who were dug into the rock trying to stop the Marines from taking it, men who kept meticulous records, filed reports up a chain of command that still functioned even as the island collapsed around them, and who, in the process, left behind an unintentional monument to the very enemy they were trying to destroy. What follows is built from those records. After-action reports recovered from captured positions, interrogation transcripts of the handful of prisoners taken, and the private writings of men who did not expect to survive long enough to be embarrassed by what they'd confided to paper. Sato was not a green officer prone to fear. His service record, reconstructed from unit rosters and the testimony of the few men under his command who survived to be processed as prisoners of war in April, shows a methodical, almost cold professional. At Namonhin in 1939, he had held a forward observation post for 11 days under sustained Soviet artillery fire and been decorated for it. In New Guinea, he had led survivors of his company through 60 miles of jungle after their position was overrun, arriving at friendly lines with 4 men out of the 31 he had started with, and had been the only officer in his battalion, according to a fellow survivor's post-war deposition, who never once raised his voice in panic during the retreat. He was, in the estimation of the men who served under him, a man who had already seen the worst the war had to offer, which is precisely why his journal entries from Iwo Jima carry the weight they do. This was not a frightened boy writing home. This was a veteran of 2 brutal campaigns, encountering something that broke the pattern of everything he thought he understood about combat. To understand why Sato's assessment mattered, and why decades later it would be cited by military historians studying the psychology of siege warfare, you have to understand what exactly climbed that mountain of ash toward him. The United States Marine Corps had been built, deliberately and over more than 2 decades, to produce exactly the effect Sato was describing in his journal without knowing it had a name. The doctrine traced back to the interwar years, when the Corps, searching for relevance after the First World War threatened to render it obsolete, reinvented itself around amphibious assault, the ugliest, most exposed form of warfare there was, where men left the relative safety of a landing craft and walked into open fire with nothing but the will to keep moving. Major General John A. Lejeune, who commanded the Corps in the 1920s and whose name would eventually adorn one of its largest bases, had written in a training memorandum that would be quoted to recruits for the next 3 decades. A Marine's first weapon is not the rifle in his hands. It is the certainty in his mind that the man beside him will not leave him, and that he will not leave the man beside him. That certainty was manufactured, deliberately and brutally, at Paris Island in San Diego, where recruits were broken down not through cruelty for its own sake but through a specific psychological architecture, shared suffering, absolute interdependence, and a doctrine that retreat without orders was not cowardice in the abstract sense, but a concrete betrayal of a specific named man standing 3 feet to your left. By early 1945, this doctrine had already been tested at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Peleliu, each landing bloodier than the last, each one reinforcing among Japanese defenders a growing, uneasy recognition that they were not facing an army that could be deterred through casualties in any conventional sense. Iwo Jima was where that recognition would curdle into something closer to superstition. It is worth pausing on what specifically the training that produced this doctrine actually looked like, because the mechanism matters as much as the outcome. Recruits arriving at Paris Island in the war's final years were subjected to a regimen that had been refined generation after generation around a single organizing insight. That fear could not be trained out of a man, but loyalty to a specific named person standing beside him could be trained in deeply enough to override it. Drill instructors paired recruits deliberately, rotating those pairings only rarely, forcing bunkmates to share fault for each other's failures. A dropped rifle, a missed inspection, a stumble on a run, so that by the end of 13 weeks, a recruit's sense of his own performance had become inseparable from his partner's. Historians of Marine Corps training have called this somewhat clinically manufactured interdependence. The men who lived through it had a simpler description. Ferrero, in a letter home written during training at Paris Island in 1943, put it this way to his mother: "They don't teach you to be brave here, Ma. They teach you that being scared alone is worse than anything that could happen to you out there, so you make sure you're never alone and then somehow you're not as scared." It is a strange thing to build an army around a boy's fear of being embarrassed in front of his friends, and yet that fear, weaponized carefully enough, produced men who would crawl toward machine gun nests rather than let the man beside them see them hesitate. The island itself was chosen for a brutally simple strategic reason. It sat almost exactly halfway between the Marianas, where American B-29 bombers were now based, and the Japanese home islands, and its capture would provide an emergency landing strip for crippled bombers and a base for fighter escorts. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, who commanded the island's defense, understood from the moment he arrived in June 1944 that he could not stop the invasion. He could only make it cost more than any operation in American history, and he restructured the island's defense entirely around that single, grim objective, abandoning the beach defense doctrine that had failed at every prior island in favor of a honeycombed underground fortress. 11 miles of tunnels connecting more than 1,500 fortified positions dug into volcanic rock, designed so that Marines would have to take the island foot by foot, cave by cave, with no single decisive battle to win and no enemy line to break, only an endless succession of positions that had to be individually located and individually destroyed. The island itself was chosen for a brutally simple strategic reason. It sat almost exactly halfway between the Marianas, where American B-29 bombers were now based, and the Japanese home islands, and its capture would provide an emergency landing strip for crippled bombers and a base for fighter escorts. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, who commanded the island's defense, understood from the moment he arrived in June 1944 that he could not stop the invasion. He could only make it cost more than any operation in American history, and he restructured the island's defense entirely around that single, grim objective, abandoning the beach defense doctrine that had failed at every prior island in favor of a honeycombed underground fortress. 11 miles of tunnels connecting more than 1,500 fortified positions dug into volcanic rock, designed so that Marines would have to take the island foot by foot, cave by cave, with no single decisive battle to win and no enemy line to break, only an endless succession of positions that had to be individually located and individually destroyed. The landing began at 9:02 on the morning of February 19, 1945. The black volcanic sand, soft, ash-fine, useless for digging foxholes and nearly impossible to move quickly through, swallowed men to their ankles as they came off the landing craft into a beach that Kurabayashi's gunners had deliberately left almost undefended in the opening minutes, waiting until the sand was packed with 8 full battalions before opening fire from prepared positions on the high ground. By nightfall of the first day, 30,000 Marines were ashore and 2,400 were already dead or wounded, and the island, 8 square miles, smaller than many American college campuses, had become the most densely fought-over piece of ground in the Pacific War. What followed over the next 5 weeks was not a battle in any sense that Sato's earlier campaigns had prepared him for. There was no front line to hold or break. There was only a mountain honeycombed with tunnels from which men kept emerging at impossible odds, absorbing fire that should by any reasonable calculation have stopped them and continuing forward. Corporal Daniel Ferrero, 20 years old, from a family of stonemasons in Providence, Rhode Island, was among the first wave to reach the base of Mount Suribachi on the afternoon of the landing. His platoon sergeant's after-action report, followed 6 weeks later from a hospital ship, records that Ferrero took a rifle round through the meat of his left shoulder within the first hour ashore, had it field-dressed by a corpsman who told him he was through for the day, and was back with his squad by nightfall carrying ammunition boxes because, according to the report, he said his arm worked fine for carrying, whatever the doctor said about it working for anything else. 3 days later, advancing on a fortified pillbox that had killed 11 Marines attempting to approach it directly, Ferrero crawled alone through open ground under machine gun fire to reach a blind angle beneath the gun slit and posted a satchel charge through the aperture, silencing the position. When his lieutenant recommended him for a Silver Star, Ferrero reportedly told him he didn't want the paperwork because his mother would see the citation in the local paper, and she already thinks I'm going to die out here and this won't help. He survived the battle. His mother did eventually see the citation. Private First Class Elmer Cho, 19, born in Los Angeles to Korean immigrant parents who had themselves fled Japanese occupation, served as a runner for his company command post, one of the most statistically lethal jobs on the island, requiring him to cross open, mapped killing ground repeatedly each day, carrying messages between positions that had no other means of communication once radios were damaged or batteries ran out. Accounts differ slightly on the exact number of runs Cho made during the battle's worst week. The surviving records put it somewhere between 30 and 40 over 5 days, but every surviving account agrees on one detail: Cho kept in his breast pocket a small paper fan his mother had given him before he shipped out, and he touched it before every run, a habit the other runners in his company noticed, and eventually adopted as their own private ritual, touching Cho's fan before their own runs as though it carried some transferable luck. Cho was wounded twice, refused evacuation both times, and was killed on his final run on March 4th, 11 days before the island was declared secure. The fan was returned to his mother with his personal effects. Sergeant Wallace Buckhalter, 23, from a sharecropping family outside Selma, Alabama, commanded a squad that spent 6 days reducing a single ridge, a stretch of ground perhaps 400 yards long that Kirabayashi's engineers had turned into one of the most heavily fortified pieces of real estate on the island. Connected by tunnels to reinforcement positions that meant a cave cleared and marked dead in the morning might be firing again by afternoon. Buckhalter's own letters home, 3 of which survived the war and were later donated by his family to a regimental archive, make almost no mention of the fighting itself. They discuss instead the quality of the canned rations, a running argument with another sergeant about a card game, and a persistent worry about whether his mule back home was being properly fed in his absence. Only in the last of the 3 letters, written 4 days before he was killed by a mortar round while marking a cave entrance for demolition, does he allow himself a single line that departs from the mundane. This place doesn't want us here, and it's telling us so in the only language it's got left, which is everything it can throw. We're telling it back that it doesn't get a vote. Second Lieutenant Marcus Whitfield, 24, a former divinity student from Ohio who had left seminary to enlist after Pearl Harbor, took command of his rifle platoon on the battle's 9th day after his commanding officer was killed, despite having no prior command experience and, according to his own later testimony to a regimental historian, no idea what I was doing beyond the fact that 40 men were looking at me to decide what happened next, and deciding nothing was somehow worse than deciding wrong. He led that platoon for the remaining 26 days of the battle. When asked years later what had gotten him through it, he reportedly said only that he had stopped praying for the battle to end and started praying instead that he would not be the man who let his platoon down in front of each other, a distinction he considered, on reflection, the only prayer that had actually been answered. There is a 5th man worth naming here, not because his individual action was more dramatic than the others, but because his position gave him a vantage point almost none of the others had. Private First Class Harold Ostrowski, 21, from a family of Polish immigrants who ran a butcher shop in Milwaukee, served as a stretcher-bearer attached to a forward aid station for the battle's duration. He carried no weapon he was permitted to fire except in the dire self-defense, and his job, over 36 days, was to walk into whatever ground had just been fought over and bring back the men who could still be saved. His own diary, recovered decades later by a grandson researching family history and eventually donated to a veterans archive, is the closest thing that survives to a comprehensive ground-level account of the entire campaign, because Ostrowski moved through nearly every sector of the island at some point in the fighting, seeing what no single rifle company saw. You start to notice, he wrote on March 9th, near the battle's end, that the men who have been out here longest stop talking about home so much and start talking instead about whoever's next to them at that exact moment. I think something in a man's head decides after enough of this that home is too far away to hold on to, so he holds on to the fellow beside him instead because that fellow is close enough to actually grip. He carried, by his own rough count kept in the diary's margins, over 90 men off the line during the battle, more than a third of whom did not survive their wounds regardless. He never spoke of the ones who died once he made it home to Milwaukee, according to his daughter's later account, but he kept the diary in a drawer for the rest of his life and read it, she said, every February. It was against this, men who documented in their own private and unglamorous words an almost banal refusal to stop, that Sato and his fellow officers began in the 3rd week of the siege to write something unusual for a Japanese military document, an attempt at formal psychological analysis of their enemy. A captured staff memorandum, recovered from a command bunker after its defenders were killed in early March, coined a term that appears nowhere in pre-war Japanese military doctrine, Shizumanai Kanjo, roughly the spirit that will not sink. The memorandum's author, whose name did not survive on the fragment, attempted to explain the phenomenon in the vocabulary available to him, not fanaticism, which the Japanese military understood intimately and had built its own doctrine around, but something the writer found harder to categorize, a collective refusal that seemed to operate independently of any individual soldier's courage, as though the unit itself, rather than the men composing it, was the thing that could not be broken. We have killed brave men before, the fragment reads in the portion that survives. Bravery, we understand, this is not only bravery. It continues past the point where bravery alone should be exhausted. I believe they have built something into these men that does not belong to the individual soldier at all, but to the space between soldiers, and it is that space we cannot seem to hit no matter how accurately we fire. A second fragment, apparently written by a more senior officer reviewing the first memorandum, appears in the margin, added in a different hand. The lieutenant's report is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that troubles me more than it troubles him. If the thing we cannot kill is not the man but the bond between men, then our entire method of defense, killing the most exposed man first, then the next, until the position collapses, is built on an assumption that no longer holds on this island. We are killing them one at a time, and they are absorbing it as a body absorbs a wound, not as a chain absorbs a broken link. I do not know how to fight an enemy that treats its own losses as fuel rather than as damage. I am not sure our doctrine has a category for what that requires of us. This annotation, more than almost any other single document recovered from the island, has been cited by post-war military historians as evidence that Japanese command, even in the battle's earliest weeks, sensed they were confronting something their existing theory of warfare simply had no vocabulary to address. The turning point of the battle, the moment that would come to define it in American memory forever, arrived on the fifth day, February 23rd, when a 40-man patrol from the 28th Marines was ordered to fight its way to the summit of Suribachi, a position Kurabayashi's own officers had privately assessed as unassailable given the fortified approach and the sheer volume of interlocking fire covering every route up the mountain. The patrol expected, by every reasonable calculation available to either side, to be annihilated before reaching the crater rim. Sato himself, dug into a position on the island's northern plateau nearly 2 miles away, recorded hearing the summit's defenders open fire that morning and noted in his journal with something close to grim satisfaction that the mountain would finally exact its price. 4 hours later, at 10:20 in the morning, a small American flag went up on the summit, and within hours a second, larger flag replaced it, an image that would become the most reproduced photograph in American military history, but which, standing at ground level rather than through the lens of history, represented something more immediate to the men still fighting across the rest of the island. Proof, delivered from the single position everyone had assumed was impossible, that nothing on the island was actually impossible, only expensive. Sato wrote that evening, "The mountain has fallen and I did not believe it could. I begin to understand that our calculations of what is possible and their calculations of what is possible are not measuring the same thing." The battle continued for 31 more days after the flag went up, a fact largely absent from the popular memory of Iwo Jima, which tends to end at the photograph rather than the funeral. Kurabayashi himself, having conducted the most sophisticated defense in depth the Pacific War had yet seen, was killed in the battle's final days, his body never conclusively identified, in keeping with his own final order to his men that no officer's rank insignia should aid the enemy in recovering it. Sato survived. He was among the small number of Japanese defenders, fewer than the number originally believed capable of survival on an island where the garrison's own commanders had told them to expect a fight to the last man taken prisoner in the battle's final week, discovered in a collapsed tunnel section, dehydrated and unable to stand, having continued alone to fire on advancing Marines for 2 days after his last remaining comrades were killed. He was processed as a prisoner of war and eventually repatriated to Japan in 1946, where he spent the remainder of his life working as a schoolteacher outside Osaka, rarely discussing the war with his students, or, according to his daughter's later account, with his own family. In 1971, at the request of a Japanese historian compiling oral accounts of the battle for a university archive, he agreed to a single recorded interview, the only extended account he ever gave of his time on the island. Asked near the end of that interview what he had ultimately concluded about the men who had taken the position he'd spent 4 months defending, he did not immediately answer. The transcript notes a long pause before he spoke again. "I concluded," he finally said, "that we had built a war around the idea that what could be measured in the individual man, and that if we broke enough individual men we would win. I do not think that is wrong exactly. I think it is simply incomplete. Something in how those men were made together meant that breaking one did not subtract from the whole the way our arithmetic said it should. I have thought about this for 26 years and I still do not fully understand it. I only know that I watched it happen, and that no explanation I have ever heard since has improved on the one I wrote in my own journal, in the dark, certain I would not live to be embarrassed by it." He was asked in that same 1971 interview whether he had ever tried to explain Shizumanai Kanjo to his own students, most of whom had been born after the war and knew Iwo Jima only as a name in a textbook. He said he had tried once early in his teaching career and had stopped because he found he could not make 15-year-olds in a peacetime classroom understand a concept he himself had only understood by living through its opposite. You cannot teach a boy what a wall feels like, he said, by describing the bricks. You can only teach him by putting your own hand against it and asking him to imagine the weight on the other side. I did not have the words for that weight in 1945, and I do not have them now. I only have the fact that I watched men who should have stopped continue, past the point where stopping would have been forgivable, past the point where anyone watching would have blamed them for it, and they did not stop, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to understand why, and I have concluded only that some questions are answered by the world once and are not meant to be answered twice. They could not be broken because breaking, in the way the Japanese command understood the term, required a threshold, a point past which resistance became irrational and self-preservation reasserted itself as the dominant instinct. What Kurabayashi's officers discovered, cave by cave and ridge by ridge across 36 days, was that the doctrine built into the men climbing that mountain had removed the threshold entirely, replacing individual calculation with something closer to a covenant. Not a promise that you would survive, but a promise that you would not be the reason the man beside you did not. They could not be broken because there was no longer a single man there to break. There was only the space between them, and no weapon on the island was built to hit that. Consider what that actually required mechanically of every single man on that mountain. It required Ferrero to carry ammunition with a shoulder that no longer worked the way a shoulder should. It required Cho to touch a paper fan and walk, again, into ground that had already tried to kill him twice. It required Buckhalter to worry about a mule 3,000 miles away in the same letter where he explained, almost as an afterthought, that the ground itself seemed to want him dead. It required Whitfield to trade the comfort of prayer for the harder discipline of simply not being the failure his men would remember. It required Ostrowski to walk, unarmed, into the aftermath of other men's worst moments again and again for 36 days, and to carry home a number 90 men, a third of them lost anyway, that he could not put down even decades later. None of these were acts of superhuman courage in the way the word is usually used. They were each of them small, specific, almost administrative decisions, repeated under conditions designed to make repetition impossible. That is the part Sato's arithmetic could not account for. He was measuring bravery. What he was fighting was habit, a habit built over years in peacetime on training fields 3,000 miles from any war that had simply outlasted every reasonable argument for its own abandonment. It is the hardest thing about this story to say plainly, and so it is worth saying plainly once at the end. They could not be broken, not because they did not bleed, not because they did not fear, not because they were somehow more than men. Every account, American and Japanese alike, insists otherwise, insists on the shaking hands and the letters about card games and the fear that outlasted the war by decades in the men who carried it home. They could not be broken because the thing being asked to break was never really the individual man at all. It was the space between him and the man beside him. And no one in 36 days on that mountain of ash ever found where that space could be hit. Sato understood this in the end better than almost anyone who fought on either side of that island, because he was given something few defeated officers are ever given, 30 more years to sit with the question. He never resolved it. He only, by his own account, stopped expecting to. And perhaps that more than any single quote in his journal is the truest measure of what climbed that mountain toward him, not an answer he could carry home, but a wall he put his hand against once in the dark and never fully stopped feeling the weight of.